Welcome back to Canon Fodder. This is episode 2, The Brothers Karamazov, part 2, with the Prudentialist. How you doing, Mr. Prudentialist?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on again.
And thank you for coming back. We had a really successful first show, over 500 listens on our small Substack, and definitely the subject matter had a lot to do with it, but also your niche internet celebrity had a lot to do with it as well. So I appreciate you coming back.
Oh, anytime. Absolutely. It was a great pleasure to talk for 2 hours about it, so I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Well, let's see if we can go for 2 more, and then however long after we have to go for, if we don't cover it all today. So last time we spoke a lot about the characters, the principal characters, the actual brothers Karamazov and their father Fyodor. Let's start because originally we were going to cover the first half of the book, and then this would be the second half, but we neglected the Grand Inquisitor, and that was partially on purpose because it's probably the thing that the book is most known for. I don't really have a whole lot to add to the discourse about it, so it's kind of like it wasn't an oversight on my part, but it is important that we do talk about it. So I wanted to get your thoughts on the Grand Inquisitor and maybe the events leading up to that speech by Ivan, or I think he calls it a poem, right? He calls it
a poem.
Yeah. So his Grand Inquisitor poem and what it means, and what you think it means, and we'll go from there.
Well, I think you have to go a little earlier prior to I think it's book 5, Pro and Contra. You have to really start earlier before you can really get into setting the scene for the Grand Inquisitor discussion itself. And I know everyone and their mother who's talked about this book always likes to fixate on the Grand Inquisitor, and I feel as if they neglect what I would argue is the stronger argument from Ivan than it is the Grand Inquisitor. Because I mean, depending on your view of, say, Roman Catholicism, you could argue that the Grand Inquisitor is like the greatest indictment of the Roman Church written by a Russian. But let's go back a little earlier. So we're in book 5, Pro and Contra, and this is after, of course, we have a scene with the money and trying to make amends for his older brother Dimitri's affairs with an officer that he assaulted, which of course did not go well. But later, of course, we have Ivan and Alyosha at a restaurant, and they're discussing over things, their brother and their family, and it's there for an escapism. And of course, we have to look at these two men. They're staunch opposites in this respect, and this is where all great conflict, moral, philosophical, political, physical, can come from, are these two forces. And Ivan and Alyosha begin discussing the existence of God, the faith, and the immortality of a soul. And of course, Ivan is an atheist, at least in the sense that he has rejected God, although his heart hasn't. He can't accept what God has done for the world or God's creation. And in this back and forth between these characters, we are exposed to a series of just concerns over suffering. And of course, at this point in time, Ivan begins to tell stories that Fyodor Dostoevsky had clipped from various newspapers in his area and in his life of the most heinous criminal things, and especially suffering towards children, that you could imagine. And so Ivan is pressing these dilemmas, and it's just like, why are these children suffering like Job in the Bible? Like these are innocents, they've never done anything. He cannot believe that a loving God, as many Christians would look at God, long suffering, great in mercy and goodness of heart, who loveth the righteous and such, and has mercy on sinners. All of a sudden, you're being posed very seriously the I guess the perennial question: if God real, why bad thing happen? But the prose in which Ivan is given from Dostoevsky's pen, I think, is arguably the strongest, because most people can make a case, and I've heard, I think we've grown up in the new atheist age, and even now where apologetics are still popular, that the historical Jesus is not the Jesus of Christianity, or that maybe there's a creator, but we abstract it to such a degree that you get like moral therapeutic deism, or you get the more radical scientific materialist understanding that there is it's a simulation and there's a creator or a computer program or something like that, and it's always a disaster, I think, in its argumentation, because you're just trying to run away and put distance between you and the creator.
You're
Whereas
trying to invent God with extra steps.
exactly, you're just coming to God with extra steps. Perfect. And whereas Ivan basically says, look, if God does exist, he's not good, but he also does nothing to alleviate suffering. And so he just watches idly by. And Ivan, famously says, if that is what's necessary to achieve salvation, I reject it. He is outright rejecting sort of the world that we've created. I says, mankind shouldn't endure injustice and misery for no reason. Why should these children that have been stuck, frozen in an outhouse and beaten with no coats, covered in feces, why should they? And so it's not that it doesn't matter if God exists or not. It's whether or not you want to quote unquote play God's game. And to me, and as Dostoevsky has said in his own work prior to his death, he's the strongest atheist, I think, ever. And some would say he's not an atheist because he doesn't reject the notion of God's existence. But I think he's an atheist in the sense that he is a man with no faith. And he is a man that sees the ugly world, and he presents himself like Job's friends, or even Job's wife. Why don't you just curse God and die? How do you dare endure this system? And God himself must be a heartless tyrant. And it even relates it back to their father, just how can you say God exists when we are the spawn of someone who is so usurious, licentious, a sensualist, a man who hates his wives and acts like the town jester, but is rich and wealthy, and he is by no means a good man, and yet here you are proclaiming faith in the Lord. Well, what's the point? And to me, that is always everyone loves to talk about the Grand Inquisitor, but I think that they're missing the better case for why people lose their faith, or why I suppose the point of religion. And I mean, for those who are maybe more low church, or just focus on the spiritual but not religious, which are very Western terms, well, we're spiritual, we have faith. And this is something even my mother has told me. She says, well, I have faith, you have religion. And I've always found that to be a very strange dichotomy, because to me, I have always viewed religion, you can't have religion without faith. Whereas in this instance, Yvonne is saying, and later as we get to the Grand Inquisitor, that we have, why have faith in a system that is meant to only maximize human suffering with no comeuppance or punishment for the righteous, outside of the belief that at the end of it all, we will be judged and be awarded according to our deeds. But that's such and for us who think in earthly or more material terms, that's such bullshit. Why bother? And again, I do think that it's this conversation between Ivan and Alyosha that is the most poignant question of faith in God, more than the Grand Inquisitor, which tells, I think, a more lovely story about what, in this instance, the Inquisition and Roman Catholicism in the 16th century. I mean, everyone's told, I think, even today, there's been Netflix series about like, what if Jesus comes back or whatever, and he's some like, and then there's always the progressive notion, oh, he's just some like brown guy living in like Syria or whatever. But it does, all those stories again and again are just the Grand Inquisitor for the modern senses. And I guess that's a good way to transition into that text itself. But I've been rambling for too long. By all means, stop me if necessary.
Hello? Hello?
Hello.
So it's interesting, and apologies out there. Lost a little bit of internet connection, so if this is choppy in the listening later, my apologies. But it's interesting that this conversation and these conversations, because there's one later with the Grand Inquisitor, are between Alyosha and Ivan, who are the only whole brothers in the story. Dmitri is from a previous marriage. Smerdyakov is born out of wedlock, and Ivan's character is very much he, he is one who has suffered his entire life, whether it's not losing his mother at a young age or being shipped off to relatives that he knows don't care for him. And I don't like to go into counterfactuals with literature or history because they're kind of bunk. But this I have in my mind this, well, what if he was raised by a mother kind of thing? Like what if he got to have a somewhat normal childhood? Because as a Karamazov, he's not going to get the ideal upbringing, but he certainly could have gotten something better if if his mother didn't die so young. And I think, and Dreyfus talks about this in his lecture series. He's a philosopher, and he uses the Brothers Karamazov as a tool of philosophy, especially uh, Ivan. But Dostoevsky chooses Ivan to make all these arguments that he himself is wrestling with. And I know that we talked about last time that Dostoevsky kind of regretted making Ivan, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on all of that.
Well, this is an important thing to consider in the backdrop of Dostoevsky, that, there have been several people who had questioned when Dostoevsky was alive, who were you to speak for the entirety of the Russian people? And he had famously lifted up his pant legs to show the scars of his ankles from his time in prison in a work camp for being a French utopian sort of socialist revolutionary before really socialism as we know it comes to be. And in that time, of course, finds God and wishes not to lose that faith at all. But I mean, he has his whole life in his past that he struggles with in his writings. I mean, this is the fourth novel of his that is sort of a murder whodunit moral philosophy, novel. And of course, this is just dripping with Russian orthodoxy of the time. And I think that you see him struggling with his own past throughout this book. Out of all of the texts that he has written, these revolutionary causes and the indignation of how he was raised, or falling into the follies of our youth. Saint Ambrose of Milan had discussed this, that men, when coming to God, it really does depend on how they were raised. Were you raised with youthful innocence and a zeal for God that had never strayed? And that man will always be joyful in his salvation and look towards the mercy and the goodness of God. Whereas those that were younger and debaucherous in their youth will be more inclined to focus more on repentance and the darkness and the gloominess that oftentimes gets associated with early Christianity. And, it makes people, and I've had people joke with it. It's just like, well, why are so many people who convert to high church traditions, Anglicans, Catholicism, Orthodoxy, they seem also depressed? And I'm like, well, that's a fair question, I suppose. And I do, again, think it goes back to the struggles that one has in their youth. If you're a debaucherous and lecherous young man, then coming to God is more of I have so much to repent for and to make up for. And it's a very heavy burden. And
we know what we deserve.
We know what we deserve, exactly. Whereas those that never strayed, they're less likely to focus on those things. And Dostoevsky, by all means, is a man well aware of what he has done, and we see him, confess his passions throughout these novels. Especially in Crime and Punishment, and and his looks on the good people, such as in The Idiot. But in this one, I think is his most personal. And I think this is also in part because I think Dostoevsky knows that his own end is near. I think people get a semblance and sense of when their death is coming.
I think it's a matter of months, right after the release of the book, that he passes away.
Passes away in 1981, yeah. And So yeah, I think this was just really a very full-throated confession of what he's struggling with. And I mean, that does bring us into sort of the Grand Inquisitor, wherein Ivan, who's already told us that he rejects the sort of standard notions of how the world works under God and salvation, so why bother? And we have to avoid it. And I just reject it. And at this point in time, we're now given, the most well-known and discussed piece of literature he's probably ever written, which is the Grand Inquisitor.
So to set up the Grand Inquisitor, this is another conversation between Ivan and Alyosha, where Ivan is trying to what he thinks is talk sense to his younger naive brother. He's trying to dissuade him from his faith. And Ivan thinks that he's doing this for at least, if not noble reasons, then not pernicious reasons. And he calls it a poem. It is a conversation between the Grand Inquisitor of the Spanish Inquisition in Spain and a reborn Jesus Christ who is on earth, healing the sick, feeding the hungry, tending to the needy, doing all of the things that you would associate with Christ. He's arrested, and the Grand Inquisitor starts to lay into him a little bit, uh, basically saying that your way doesn't make people happy. In fact, your way leads them to their own doom. If we rule them with an iron fist, then the they know where they can cross and where they shouldn't cross, and they can just walk the straight and narrow path by force if necessary, and they'll enjoy it more. Uh, Christ, of course, doesn't say anything. In fact, the Grand Inquisitor speaks for Jesus the whole time, which I think is an interesting device that Dostoevsky uses here, and probably good in terms of heresy. You never want to speak for God, but all Jesus does at the end is just kisses the Grand Inquisitor, and the Grand Inquisitor is just forced to let him go. He's so overcome uh, that he's forced to let him go. You did a stream a while ago about Ben-Hur with Geo and someone else. Do you remember this?
Yeah, it was with Furious Pertinax, who's usually on as a regular guest and co-host with Apostolic Majesty, covering history. And Ben-Hur is it's a piece of fiction written by a former American Army officer,
Lou
Lou,
Wallace.
Lou Wallace, and it is the only piece of American fiction that I know so far that was blessed by the Pope. A very, America's a Protestant country as it is, has a very interesting relationship to the papacy that even our sort of deist, weird Christian founders who did all the wars against the Barbary pirates and the Ottoman Turks gets a blessing by the Pope very early on in its existence, saying we've done more for Christendom than the Europeans, which is funny considering that most of English churchmen and those in America would have rejected the Pope outright. But
So I only bring that up because
it's one of my favorite. Yeah, it's one of my favorite movies.
it's a great film, and the only reason I bring it up is because there's the scene where Charlton Heston, who is playing Ben-Hur, he's dying of thirst, right? And he says, my God, help me!" And you don't even see Jesus; you see him give him water. You don't see his face, but you see his hand. You just know, and you see just by the look on people's faces, you know that you're encountering God. And there's this Roman centurion who's really really angry that Ben-Hur is getting water, and he's about to whip Jesus, but all he does is look at him, and suddenly the guilt of all this man's many sins are just on his face, and he can't even look at Jesus because he knows how unworthy he is. And I only bring that up because that's the sort of emotion that I think that the Grand Inquisitor has at the end of this conversation, and that's kind of the point, is that you can rationalize and you can argue against God, against religion as much as you want. But when you come face to face with the divine, there's just nothing you can say or do.
If there is a 1975 film, it's 20 some odd minutes long. You can watch it on YouTube for free. John Gielgud does this for the Open University, and he plays the Grand Inquisitor, and is probably the best performance I've ever seen of the Grand Inquisitor. That I would recommend people watch. You can watch it for free; it's fantastic. But the prose itself, I mean, this is some of the best written parts of this book by anybody, and by anyone will tell you that this is the best part of the book, which I kind of find funny because I think that there are much better parts in this book. But I suppose it just depends on where you come from. But again, our Grand Inquisitor, the Grand Cardinal himself, a man of 90 years old, who probably would have been more surprised by what would have come had he been a younger man. Perhaps he's delusional, perhaps he is not. And Alyosha, listening to the story, is somewhat naively unsure of himself. You know, what do you mean? Is it an irony thing? Is this a case of mistaken identity? Are you really talking about the Lord himself? But again, we go on and we listen to this cardinal simply say, "We have done the very things that you rejected." And he's referencing Christ's 40 days and nights in the desert, where he is tempted by Satan himself. And of course, feed yourself, turn these rocks into bread, cast yourself upon there. And if you're the Lord, the angels will be there. The world will worship you. And Christ answers, thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God, away with me, Satan. I'm not going to do these things. Showing his obedience, of course, to God the Father and what is written in the law and in Scripture. But instead, the cardinal answers and says, "You have rejected these things, and we, as the Roman Church, have taken up those temptations, and look at how we rule. And you are not needed anymore. The belief in you is not needed anymore. We, as mortal men, have created the institution in your name. Your will be damned, our will be done, which is in your name. And now they bow down to us. This need for community, they'll fall down before their idols. But now, it doesn't matter if men will not live by bread alone. He'll listen to us, and we can feed them, and we can free them. For you have said man is free by your death and the conquering of hell. And now you are silent. And because you are silent, we, the so-called successors of your church and apostles, will do what you couldn't do, and we'll rule the world. So why would you come back? What's the point? Why now? Why here? Why now, after we've just spent yesterday burning all these heretics in the town square? You laid the foundation, as he says, the destruction of your own kingdom, and no one else should be blamed for it. And yet, is that really what was offered to you? Three powers on earth, capable of eternally vanquishing and ensnaring the conscience of those feeble mutineers, the people for their happiness: miracle, mystery, and authority. You reject the second and the third, and you gave the lead in doing so. And so he says that the Roman Church can do those three things: miracle, mystery, and authority. We don't need you, but we'll do these things in your name. Which, of course, if you know Scripture, and especially if you know anything from the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane asking, the Mount of Olives, Christ offers these parables about the end and how we're to be judged. And I think really the most terrifying thing in Scripture from Christ's words are when men will be there at the judgment seat of Christ, and they'll say, well, we did these things in your name. We cast out devils in your name. We helped the poor, healed the sick. And Christ will answer, verily, amen, I say to you, I do not know you. Be gone from me. And that is the most terrifying thing, I think, in respects to the judgment that we'll all face at the end of our lives. But in this part, we're given this great Pharisaical hypocrisy of the church, or the Roman Church, to where we don't need you. we have the three things that we need to rule over men: miracle, mystery, and authority. And you may have set it up, but you rejected those things by your death. This very, I think, Western understanding. I mean, this is the thing about how, you know, Christianity looks to so many outsiders. I've heard many priests, both Catholic and Orthodox, talk about it. It's just like, you know, it's bizarre, you know, that there's this desire for a political warrior king Messiah from the Pharisees, and then to the Gentiles, it seems bizarre that God himself would be voluntarily taking on the most humiliating form of suffering, which is Roman crucifixion, for the forgiveness of sins and to conquer death. But in this, the Grand Inquisitor simply says, you know, we will do what happened the last time you came here, and we'll do it again and again and again. And of course, this poem ends with Christ just kissing the man. And of course, the conversation ends. And of course, there's some discussions over, you know, the worst parts of Roman Catholicism. Ivan tells Alyosha, you know, the Jesuits, the Inquisitors, their Pope. But really, you know, Ivan just presses him. He says, do you think that this would happen with you? Like, why would you believe? Are you more in the authority of the church or in the authority of God? And Alyosha answers, I think, in really the only way that you could answer, straight in the same way Christ does, and he kisses him. And I can't do it justice, and I know no one really can, despite numerous lectures from much more famous people than ourselves, Hudson. But, you know, I know that we didn't want to talk about it too much, but it is the question that so many of the faithful in the world have, is that, are we prepared if he were to return? That is sort of the thing that we are always supposed to be doing. We look for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the age to come. We face towards the east, and we are aware that Christ could come like a thief in the night, and we just never know. Which is why the master wants to see you working, not always arguing when he's going to come back. I've always found the end times prophecy people to be kind of ignoring what Jesus says, but it really is it poses the question to especially church faithful. You just wonder to yourself, you know, would they do it again? Is the institution already corrupted? And what do you do with that in the midst of being told about the greatest mystery of all, which is that the Lord, through his Son, becomes incarnate on earth as man, takes on the form of a servant. And there is no other choice, as prophecy and scripture tells us, that he was going to endure a humiliating death. The Wisdom of Solomon has one of the best Christological prophecies in there, especially in chapter 2. And, you know, church continues, and the church, is it still following what Christ intended? Or is it just rejected it in the sake of those satanic temptations over power and political entities? And it is really one of the best pieces in this entire book. I think that there are other scenes, of course, that mirror this. I think the courtroom scene, of course, with Dmitri is well worth its own courtroom drama in and of itself. I wish more people did acting of, but you can't avoid discussing this book without discussing the Grand Inquisitor, and everyone has their own take on it. I know there's some accepted themes that everyone discusses, but you know, if you are a non-Roman Catholic, and this isn't, I'm not meant to dissing on this, but I think that you can definitely see the Russian spirituality, the Russian sense of a cocked eyebrow towards the Roman Church in this instance.
So it's interesting. I'm going to keep referencing the Dreyfus talk that I it's a 10-hour lecture on this book, and also because he before this he goes over Kierkegaard, and he talks about how Kierkegaard, you know, I mean, he's the Protestant philosopher, and he thinks that Dostoevsky might have been familiar with Kierkegaard, and that Jesus in this poem is a representation of the Protestant Church, where, you know, obviously the Inquisitor is the Roman Church, and neither of them have satisfactory answers for what to do with suffering as far as Dostoevsky is concerned. And it's actually Zosima who is the representative of the Orthodox Church that Dostoevsky kind of sides with, and is his answer to suffering in the world, where you're doing what you can despite your own imperfection. Any thoughts there?
Well, I always tell people, and I've said this on other streams, but I said if you want to understand sort of the statement of God is dead and we have killed him, I think that there are three men that you have to read in conjunction, in relation to one another, even though they didn't know each other. And that's Dostoevsky, that's Kierkegaard, and that's Nietzsche. You have to read all three of them. Why do we think that God is dead? Why does Nietzsche think that? Why do you think that we have failed in this instance? And I think Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky, in their own regions of the world, are struggling with a very similar answer in the midst of revolutionary fervor, the destruction of the Ancien regime, the aftermath of the Reformation, and sort of the political precariousness of the Roman Church, and the sort of the question, a lot of people might ask when they look at more Catholic or Orthodox things is like, well, where's Jesus in this picture? And those are very valid questions. And of course, Kierkegaard, who I have a great love for, he's got quite a few other pieces in his life. He had a pseudonym called Anti-Climacus, which I've always found interesting because Climacus is I associate that name with Saint John Climacus, or Saint John of the Ladder, who is a very famous Orthodox monastic and ascetic and a saint, and he wrote, of course, the Ladder of Divine Ascent and how we can deny ourselves. It's meant for monks. It's not really meant for us as regular lay people, but still, you know, you see a world where Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky are looking at things like Hans Holbein's The Dead Christ and such for me, but I mean, I think when you look at, for instance, say Dostoevsky's answer, the answer becomes it's the will to endure and the will for faith. I mean, I think Orthodoxy puts a specific focus on suffering more than Kierkegaard does, where Kierkegaard is, I think, just intrinsically and innately focused on the question of our existence and our role. Or do we have the right to be put to death as Christians for the truth? And I just in Dostoevsky, in relation to the Grand Inquisitor and all this conversation, I think what you really do get out of it is this: how in the midst of a revolutionary Europe, where men will liberate themselves from God and from power and say that they are free, how does the faith, how does the institution of a church respond to that? And the Grand Inquisitor, I think, and into the perspective, at least of the Inquisition and Ivan talking about the Roman Church, I think Dostoevsky is criticizing that the moment you become this focused solely on a temporal entity, not an entity that is eternal, that the gates of hell will not prevail against, then you lose yourself to the same revolutionary ideals and you are adapting and you lose it out. That in order to placate the people and to rule over the people, regardless of whether they believe or not, you would kill God again just to maintain that grip on power. And again, I think that you see, and I don't know how much Dostoevsky actually read of Nietzsche or if he was familiar with him, but I think that the spirit of man's role in life when revolution and godlessness is abound, how does one respond to it? I mean, the Grand Inquisitor illustrates maybe what not to do. And and again, it goes back to what Christ says, what shall it profit a man if he is to gain the whole world but lose his soul? And I think the Cardinal, the Grand Inquisitor himself in the story, 90 years old, has already lost his soul. And he's okay with the fact that he's lost his soul, because it means that all that his life's work is meant to maintain those powers of miracle, mystery, and authority. And we'll do what the Jews did, and we'll kill you again if it means to maintain our power.
And will save the world, of course.
Of course.
And you want to hear something kind of disturbing?
Yeah.
Most academic scholarship on this poem side with the Grand Inquisitor. And I
Well,
learned that from Dreyfus. And I definitely have to put a link to this 10-hour talk uh, at the in the show notes, because it's just incredible. And he talks about, or rather, I guess the point there is that, don't believe people who have moral uh, indignation towards the church, because they're going to do the same thing when they have power. It's it, they're not these crusaders against the use of power against one's enemies, but rather that they know that they're the enemy and they want that power to use it on you.
well, let's turn to a section from the Grand Inquisitor for a second, right? You did not come down from the cross when they shouted to you, mocking and teasing you. Come down from the cross, and we will believe that it is you. You did not come down because, again, you did not want to enslave man with a miracle, because you thirsted for a faith that was free, not miraculous. You thirsted for a love that was free, not from the servile ecstasies of the slave before. The might has inspired him with dread once and for all. But even here, you had too high an opinion of human beings, for of course they are slaves, and they are created mutineers. Look around you and judge. Now that 15 centuries have passed, take a glance at them. Which of them have you borne up to yourself? Upon my word, man is created weaker and more base than you supposed. Can he perform the deeds of which you are capable? And respecting him so much, you acted though as you had ceased to have compassion for him, because you demanded too much of him. And yet, who was this? The very one you had loved more than yourself. You had respected him less. Had you respected him less, you would have demanded of him less, and that would have been closer to love, for his burden would have been lighter. He is weak and dishonorable. And I always find that I've this part kind of always is interesting to me, because I think for a lot of people it's always the subject of, well, we are free, and it's the question of free will. But then you read the epistles in the Bible, and you'll see Paul or Peter and them, a bond servant of Jesus Christ. And of course, it's
Basically a slave, yeah.
basically a slave.
Yeah,
And
I think it's in Romans they talk about even predestination, and I don't want to get in too far afield, but just you know the idea of Calvinist predestination, that maybe free will isn't exactly free. But again, really not here or there. Maybe we can do another talk sometime about the different sects
well,
of Christianity.
to quote a friend of mine, Calvinism is my favorite heresy. It's the most interesting. Um, but that's like you said, a desire for another day, in that respect. But I think that it is. I consider that the Inquisitor just has such a lowly opinion of man, that he rejects the notion that is said by the Lord himself, that through me and with me all things are possible. Ask with faith and prayer, and it shall be received unto you. And if even with the mustard seed of faith you can move a mountain, which we discussed in, I think, in the section, the first episode where we talked about this, because even Smirnikov is just like, who rejects God outright and is the ultimate sort of sociopath. The logical conclusion of Ivan's ideas and his beliefs, that maybe there are one or two people out there that can move mountains because their faith is so strong. And for those who are of the faithful, we do know that there are countless miracles. I'm not a believer. No one should believe in cessationism. I reject that outright. Miracles still happen every day, and with faith that they can be achieved. And whereas here, it's just like, well, man is too lowly and weak and an animal, and he offers this quasi Machiavellian understanding that he follows his base instincts, and you were asking him to do the impossible. You were asking him to fundamentally change his nature. And what's the point in that? Which, of course, Scripture gives us multiple times in the Old and New Testament. I mean, St. Paul is the best example of this. The Pharisee of Pharisees, the Jews of Jews, changes his life entirely to be a bondservant of Jesus Christ, and dies in that faith and firm conviction to finish his race and fight the good fight. Whereas the Grand Inquisitor simply is like, there's no, not everyone can do that. Why bother? You think too highly of us, despite the fact that we are made in God's image. And it's a very powerful question and a very powerful set of claims that you are asking us to do too much. You are asking us to do things that are impossible. Um, and some people will look at scripture and think, though, what a nice story, or what a bunch of BS. But at the end of the day, the Grand Inquisitor, I think, is the ultimate embodiment of, this may work for some people, but it isn't going to work for the masses. So we're just going to do our own thing instead. And we'll just kill you. We don't need you anymore. God is dead. And again, if you are a Christian man, you should read Nietzsche to understand where he's coming from. But you need to read Kierkegaard, and most importantly, Dostoevsky, if you want an answer to what these three men were writing about and struggling with in an age of revolution and the post-Christian era that followed the revolutions of America and France. But I'll leave it there. I feel like the Grand Inquisitor is, everyone talks about it, like you said, everyone reads it, but to me, it is you have to. It's heavy, and with good reason. And Alyosha doesn't know how to respond immediately, so he kisses his brother on the lips, loves him regardless, an overriding act of love and forgiveness. The holy kiss, as we're sort of instructed to offer when we greet people in according to scriptures.
And it actually shocks Ivan at first. Yeah, he's ready for an intellectual debate. Like I was saying, he's ready for even because he knows Alyosha is not an intellectual. He's not even particularly bright, but he's waiting for. It's like showing up to a boxing match and you're fighting Mike Tyson, and he's just waiting to give you a haymaker, and you just hug him, and of course, then he gets his wits about him. Ivan does, and he says, "Well, you only did that because I said it first." Like he has to he has to reestablish his cynicism right away after the shock wears off.
Of course, this is why famous debates in the past would be like, well, we are at an impasse. We do not agree on these core fundamental things. So the debate really can't pursue any further. Whereas nowadays, people just talk past each other, right? And they're here for their dunks and their parasocial audience fandom, saber rattling. But
in older times, once the debate ended, that's when the war began.
Right. But in this instance, this is the fundamental divide. This is that faith surpasses reason. St. John Chrysostom had said famously that an understood God is no God at all. If we know everything about him, then what is God really? And I think with Ivan, right, you get this logical, well thought out argumentation about why the church has failed, or why Christ has been ultimately rejected. The mission of God has failed. But with faith, Alyosha kisses him, but Alyosha still holds to his faith, at least during this time. And those are things that logic cannot fully comprehend. And you can
because his faith does waver in the first conversation.
Oh, of course. Oh, of course.
He
is shaken to his core by those stories.
Ivan asks him, would you consent to the existence, knowing about all this suffering? And Alyosha's like, no. Like it's very clear that he's never even considered the suffering of the world in any real way.
Yeah,
which makes sense for his character too, because he's just the guy who's always provided for. He's the youngest child. He's the baby. People love to take care of him.
He's never
I
he's
think we
never
established.
been, yeah, like Dostoevsky's the narrator, flat out says, you could drop him in a city of 1 million people and you would never have to worry about him being robbed or homeless. He would have been taken care of. And he's
I'm
only experienced, he's only seen the good in the world.
I'm reading Hunger by Newt Hampson right now for this podcast where I'm going to talk about it with Jay Burden.
All right.
And I'm just thinking about how it would be a much different book if it was Alyosha, who was the starving artist in what is now Oslo, which was Christiana, I think was the name of the city at one point.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, it's just interesting.
Because he's
Um,
never experienced suffering. He's been taken care of. He has a faint memory, of course, of his mother, which still affects him. He's a very innocent young man, a sensitive young man, you might say, but with a deeply held faith that has never met contact with the enemy. And this is Ivan giving him that first contact. Like, here is real human suffering. Tell me, oh, innocent and student of this wise elder whom some call a saint, why bother? What are you doing? um and he is speechless and he doesn't know what to do. And but I feel like for many Christians that still is the case, especially in America. We live still for now in relatively good times. I mean, yes, things are really bad, but I mean, we don't see those things on a day-to-day basis. I mean, we can with Twitter, and our faith can definitely be shaken. But Alyosha at this time, he has no contact with a world that really makes you wonder, well, why, if God real, why bad thing happened? And if you don't have faith, or if it's been shaken, that question's incredibly powerful. I know a lot of theists or believers will, make it a mocking question. But if you don't have faith, or if you don't have an answer to that question, it's a very compelling one. And this is Alyosha's first real hit with the cold water of reality, where it isn't a nice world. And this is the jagged. I mean, he's the middle child, but I mean, it's the jagged and jaded middle child who has had no reason to see good in the world, see the younger innocent beauty of his younger brother, and why bother?
and that's another thing too, is because I mentioned before that Ivan at least thinks that he's doing his brother a favor, right? But he's essentially trying to destroy something beautiful. Uh, one, because he doesn't understand it, and two, because he hates it. And he might say that he's trying to educate him, or he's trying to, and maybe in some ways he's hoping that Alyosha has a satisfactory answer for him, uh, which I think is borne out with the kiss at the end, because he's actually surprised, and he lets his guard down even for a moment, and there is maybe a spark of the divine there in Ivan, but he's essentially trying to kill his brother's faith, if only because he doesn't have it himself.
And I mean, that's sort of I mean, this is why when this sort of poem ends, Alyosha just is so incredibly heartbroken. He just says, "You don't believe in God." And even if he doesn't have a voice, I know actors and things like that, extreme sorrow. And I mean, the English translation, I'm sure, butchers what might be the Russian word for that. And it's just, he's so sad to hear this story be played out along with these conversations, to know that his brother doesn't have faith, and Alyosha's just broken. And he just looks at his brother, who's looking at him with that like sneering, mocking sense of, I'm better than you. I have mocked you. I have spat at your faith and your religion. And yeah, it is. I don't know, really. I mean, it does end, of course, with Yvonne some sort of just tempting him and teasing him about it. It's just like, well, you are taught as an Orthodox Christian about the Roman Church from your elders at the monastery that, the Catholic movement of recent centuries is nothing but a desire for power and earthly comfort. Everything I have said is in accordance to the teachings of Russian spirituality and Christianity. So why are you so upset? And it's not that he's upset at the story; he's upset that his brother doesn't believe. And of course, this faith that there has been a crack, I think, in Alyosha's wall of being tempted, and we see this later throughout the rest of the story. But Ivan is the worst off of the three. I mean, Dmitri, of course, will suffer, and I mean, no, the book's almost 200 years old. I think it's safe to say it's okay to spoil it, but
I've really come to hate the spoiler alert.
Yeah, I know. I totally fair, right? But like Alyosha's faith will be tested, but I mean he comes back to it. Ivan is basically ready to kill himself, whereas Dmitri, who does unjustly, is convicted and suffers. He is the one at the end of the story, I think, who is on the path towards repentance. And Dmitri, of course, is the stand-in for Dostoevsky. And yeah, I mean, so there you go. There's our Grand Inquisitor discussion.
So I want to move on to Elder Zosima's death, but I just want to one quick thing about Ivan. There is a moment before all this that I think says more about his character and kind of gives credence to my idea about him just being sort of like a lost kid looking for his mother. There's, Fyodor Karamazov is berating Alyosha, and Alyosha starts, basically he breaks down and starts crying, and Fyodor Karamazov's like, look at this sad excuse. He's just like the Shrieker. His mother was the same exact way, and Fyodor's talking to Ivan about this, and he's like, kind of because he thinks they're buddies, right? Even though Fyodor is terrified of Ivan, and we're going to see why in a moment. And all Ivan can say is, "She was my mother too."
Yeah,
and you have like this a drunk Fyodor Karamazov sobers up right away, and he's like, "What?" And he's like, "Your mother? I don't know about your mother," but it's very much like Ivan has been completely forgotten in his life. And for all his intelligence and for all his atheism, he's just a broken child who grew up. And that's the thing about Dostoevsky, is that he doesn't spell it out for you. It's right there on the page though. And everybody calls him a psychologist. And I think, I mean, even Freud says that he admired Dostoevsky, Jung as well. Like the whole field of psychology could be summed up in the body of Dostoevsky's works.
in a way. I mean, this goes to the sort of Ivan Illich writing stuff, right? Where it's
Well, that's Tolstoy, but
no, not Ivan Illich. What's his name? He's the one who wrote Medical Nemesis. Ivan Illich. Sorry. These are questions about the medical profession. And he talks about the life of. He was an Austrian priest and theologian, but he was a Roman Catholic. But to me, he wrote some great works on sort of the medicalization of Western medicine, and he also talks about sort of the discussion of what's the word I'm looking for? Some of the limits, of course, to our understanding of our minds and our brains, and the way he writes about it is really, it's a really good book. I would recommend that people read it. But it's like the complaint that people have about psychology, that it has replaced the confessional. and it has replaced confession. And but nowadays, instead of the priest telling you how to improve your life or what to do and giving you spiritual advice, it's you're paying some libtard money to make you a libtard in order to be happy, and here's some pills for it.
Did
I
you
don't
see
know.
that?
It's that Abdullah Youssef tweet that's so popular. Therapy is just paying someone until they turn you into a liberal.
Did you see that that one post online? It was this is what therapy does, and it's like this lady has like yarn coming out of her head or something, and the therapist is like winding it up or something. Like, it's a stupid cartoon, and then somebody did an edit of it where it's like, oh, this is your father's fault. Oh, this is the fault of men. Oh, mutilate yourself and turn your hair blue or whatever. Uh, yeah, therapy's kind of bullshit. But anyway, uh, Elder Zosima passes away in the novel. Probably about the midpoint of the novel, he dies, and almost immediately, his body starts to his body. What's the word? Rigor mortis sets in, and he starts to smell terribly.
Corruption.
Yes, that's the word. His body corrupts, which, if you're a saint, and one of the reasons I want some of the evidence for sainthood is when you die, your body does not corrupt. Your body does not smell terribly. You just kind of are. Your body just kind of is.
Usually, not always but yes, incorrupt relics are often associated with the saintliness of a person, or it is a sign that there has been an endowed holiness with this man and such. So, we've seen throughout the rest of the book, and I feel like it's important to also address the fact of on sort of Elder Zosima's deathbed, where we are given his life as well. He was like Dmitri, Alyosha's brother. He was a military man. He had this love for a woman that would not marry him. He was ready to come to a duel, but before he goes off to, basically kill this guy, he sees the desire to change. But also his brother reminds him of Alyosha, a spiritual influence on him, a critic of religion, became a drunkard, becomes a powerful change right before his death. And, in this, we get great foreshadowing that Alyosha's brother Dmitri is going to suffer and potentially have a very Zosima-like path. But also that Zosima has given him and told him basically that, I don't want you to be a monk. I want you to live in the world. You're going to do a lot of good in the world by your actions. And this is where you see the great influences. We talked about this last time, but the Elder Zosima is best seen not in the Saint Ambrose of Optina that we were discussing, but it's more so Saint Seraphim of Sarov and Saint Tikhon of Zdansk. And there's a saying by Saint Seraphim of Sarov, which you'll see this in most icons of him. He usually holds a scroll. But it says, acquire a peaceful spirit and thousands around you will be saved. Again, a very tall order. A lot can only be accomplished through Christ. But he basically tells Alyosha to do that, be out in the world, and to acquire that peaceful spirit.
He gives him his own Grand Commission.
He does.
Great Commission, yeah.
He gives him his final orders from your elder, which of course the first book in this whole collection of stories and novel explicates the sort of tradition of an elder having the authority over you on this earth for you to obey as a monk. And numerous stories are about that out there. But yeah, Zosima gives his spiritual child his last orders. And we get all these great homilies in here. This is why I think that this book is so good, especially if you're a Christian. Like, you want to listen to Elder Zosima's, his homilies, I think, are really the best parts of this book. Because if you know any Russian saints or Russian fathers, like especially the two that I've just mentioned, Saint Tikhon and Saint Seraphim, like you're going to see a lot of those two in there. There's a great book I'm currently reading called The Gathering of Spiritual Riches, which is by St. Tikhon, and you definitely can see the influence that Dostoevsky took from these holy men. Whereas Zosima is talking about, of course, the world and the people he's encountered, and he talks about a murder and all these sort of faithful turnings, road to Damascus, come to Jesus like stories where men change their faith and forgive and do what's necessary. Zosima basically will tell you that the love and fear of God and the love toward all men is what will overcome sin. Whereas Ivan basically says we're so base, we're our baser instincts, and cold logic is the only way that we can deal with the world. That love and faith in God and the power of that faith is only weakness. And again, this is where I think you see that the Western attitudes that Dostoevsky had in his youth come to challenge an older man who has found faith in God. And, we get this great story about the murderer, which of course is also slightly foreshadowing what happens in the rest of the book. But Elder Zosima describing the story of the narrative of a murderer and forgiveness and punishment not only serves as a great foreshadowing tool, but it also serves as the sort of almost like a Thomistic disputation, point counterpoint type deal here, wherein Dostoevsky lays out the atheistic claim, and then we're now going to offer the response to it and illustrate why the heretic's position is wrong. And of course, Zosima is telling his youthful duel and the murders and the murderer committed and the crimes of passion all over women. Women ruin everything. Remember that, kids?
Women weaken legs.
Women weaken legs. And this is what leads men to murder and insatiable lust for power. And then soon after that, Zosima's dying and basically just says, look, you're going to enter a very great trial, as will all the Karamazov brothers. And he sort of gives prophecy to this. And he says, you will be challenged, you will suffer, but you must be able to endure via love and faith. And if you can't do that, you will fail. And then Zosima dies. So he doesn't die with any fear, resentment, or regret. He accepts what is to come. And then, we're immediately just given the odor of corruption. And he has a putrid stench to him. He's quickly decomposing, and everyone's like, oh, this is a bad omen. This is bad. He wasn't a holy man. He was a jerk. He was evil. He was awful. And for, blessed is he that believes but does not see. The real challenge is, and Alyosha's already challenged with it, right? And he's hearing so much shit talk throughout the book, even when Elder Zosima is alive. Plenty of good saintly people who, they don't need to be canonized as saints. There are plenty of great people that have lived in the world that have left a tremendous impact on you, who were believers. But, everyone wants a holy man. It's that earthly pride. Oh, if we have a saint with incorrupt relics, people will come here and it'll bring more money to the monastery. People will visit us and confess and be our, ask us for our prayers and blessings. Da, 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 da. Very valid criticisms of sort of, how monasteries can be affected by the sins of the world. But it does illustrate, he doesn't have to be a holy man in the sense that he has to be a saint. But it sort of, can you maintain the lesson in the midst of everyone who is already, disregarding him, or, oh, so much for this guy type deal.
And then you also have the other monks who are kind of taking perverse joy. Joy is too strong a word, but they're definitely, they see his corruption, and they feel somewhat vindicated for their dislike of Zosima, and they think they can kind of, they even like talk a little shit about him in death, which is, these are still men, holy or not.
Yeah. And I mean, like, that uneasiness is extended to a point where Therapont wants to exorcise the cell, thinking like, well, he corrupted so fast, he must have been a demoniac, he must have been possessed. But he struggles not to. But of course, Alyosha, he's shaken to his core. Like your spiritual father is all of a sudden, forced to deal with, and this is where he.
And that's where Alyosha gets set up too.
Yep.
One of the monks, Ratikin, Rakitin, yes. He sets
a
Alyosha
seminary
up to fail.
student, by the way, and offers him booze and sausage. And as we said in the last time, this whole story takes place during Lent, right before Great and Holy Pascha, right before Easter. And for the Orthodox, Lent is a little hardcore. You're vegan for 40 days. So no booze, although the booze part's funny because I know plenty of priests who still drink during Lent. There's a story of my first priest when he was just recently becoming Orthodox. He had abstained from beer during Lent, and his priest was like, "You gave up beer for 40 days? Like, there are other things that you could have given up." But yeah, so we're given.
He's tempted, much kind of in parallel to Christ in the desert, food, sustenance, and then at the end, he's stuck in a room with Grushenka, who, as we mentioned last time, is the town pump. The which is a great phrase I'd never heard before, and I'm going to start using it. But she is also the object of Dmitri and Fyodor Karamazov's affections. They literally come to blows over trying to seduce her, and here is innocent, shaken Alyosha, basically in a room with the whore of Babylon.
And then, of course, we're told a little bit of Grushenka's story, and it's brought to town by a merchant named Samsonov, taken in by a widow. Rumored at the time she's betrayed a lover. Her affections are in order to the merchant to win his protection. Scarcely looked after. She's a beautiful woman, but she's eventually, of course, pursued by many men for marriage, and she has some money, but none succeed. And yes, she is very much like a town pump, and she misses her former lover, an officer, and she's just, she kind of points out that, these people that are here, I'm waiting to hear back about my former love, but oh, by the way, here are these two, men from the monastery. One's this prideful little shit, and the other one is Alyosha, who's known for his purity and his way to cover himself up. He doesn't like hearing naughty things or anything like that, and she sits on his knee and is playing as sort of the temptress. But then Elder Zosima is dead, and she has a sudden moment where she's sad, and all of a sudden, what am I to make out of this? And it's that moment of faith again, where they talk about their lives and who they are, and ironically, it is the harlot that restores Alyosha's faith. And there's also the great story of the onion in here. But yeah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's. I've told you this before, that if Dostoevsky was writing today, he'd be writing about incels and OnlyFans girls. And it's interesting to me that while Grushenka isn't redeemed in this story, their interaction gets them both on the path to redemption, if that makes sense. Alyosha comes into the story naive. His faith is completely shaken. and then after Zosim's dead, and after Grushenka and him get very close to breaking him, he's now the sort of holy man, or the sort of Christian that can face someone like Ivan and hold his head up high and have an answer to tough questions about the nature of the world. It's a very well done part of the book.
So we're given again the story of the onion, and a friend of mine, a mutual of mine, I should say, Graventus, and he's got a little YouTube channel called the Tablion, and he sort of talks about this story in depth. And there's a similar story told in Buddhism, but Grushenka tells us the parable of the onion, to where this woman is in hell and is praying and is asking to get out of hell. And the angel, the guardian angel, is just like, well, have you done any good in your life? What message can I relay back to the Lord? What can I do? And oh yeah, here I gave I gave a beggar an onion. If the angel can take the same onion and pull the woman out of the lake of fire, she can go to heaven. But if it breaks, she will remain in hell. And so the angel pulls out the onion and says, grab on to its roots and pull yourself out. But as she's being pulled out of hell, other people grab onto the woman, hoping to see their chance out of hell. She's selfish and kicks the other people off. The onion breaks and the woman falls into hell forever. And of course, Grushenka is telling the story to show off how awful she's been, and all these men that she's done, and that she's promised Rakitin money to bring Alyosha over there to seduce and corrupt him and to take revenge on Alyosha's perceived sense of righteousness. But in this moment, all of a sudden they're like, oh, what's the point? We can be better. And Grushenka, having empathy for Alyosha in the midst of his grief since his spiritual father has died, he has the strength to endure. And again, that peaceful spirit is now being acquired, and Grushenka is now on the path towards righteousness, and Alyosha's faith is restored in the moment of temptation and a fall. And it's a beautiful story, and the writing, even in the English translation, the onion story is really, really good. And I sincerely wish that the people will do that.
Dostoevsky litters this book with parables, and
as any Christian writer would.
Right. And yeah, it's funny. I'm in a group chat with a few different writers, and I was talking about how Jesus was the ultimate storyteller, because rather than and I mean, he commanded his most loyal followers, he commanded the apostles, but to even them and to lay people, he spoke to them in parable, and he spoke to them in stories, because it's much easier for a person to do the right thing when they come to that answer themselves than to be told what to do. And I mean, we can even go back to the Grand Inquisitor for that, where you have Christ setting a good example versus the Catholic Church, who is compelling goodness out of people out on pain of death. Dostoevsky is just, and it's funny because when we look at he'll the way that he wrote a book, he would have an idea for something, and that would end up being a very small part of the book, and the rest of the book is sort of him setting up that one idea that he had. In Crime and Punishment, it's the drunk at the beginning that Raskolnikov meets in his tale. That the whole rest of that book sort of comes out of that one idea. For Brothers Karamazov, it's the Grand Inquisitor speech in a lot of ways, and it's the book has a few different ideas, but chiefly that, and he's trying to set up this basically set up the rest of the book so that that conversation can happen. I as somebody who tries to write, it's something that I really admire about the man and his abilities.
Well, and I mean, for us, Dostoevsky is thankfully kind enough to offer explanations to his parables, or to make them clear enough for the reader to understand. Whereas, of course, Christ's parables, even the disciples would be like, "Well, what do these things mean?" But no, I can definitely understand where you're coming from. I am not as much of a fiction writer as I wish I could be. I used to write a lot of stories when I was younger, only to lose that out as I started doing more argumentative and political writing. But I think that there's these small snippets in the book. I mean, like with the Grand Inquisitor, everyone focuses on, but the tale of the onion, or the tale of how Smirnikov came to be. These are all really beautiful, even if they're ugly stories, like the birth of Smirnikov and all that. Like, these are still wonderful stories and wonderful parables about the life and the world and the evil and the good that exists, and how man can be prideful, but how man can find redemption. You don't get that a lot, and I mean, and we're very blessed to have this book. And in the instance, there's so much chalked in here that you could spend an entire academic career talking about one story, like so many do with the Grand Inquisitor. Um, which is why everyone comes back to this book, and it still remains to be one of the greatest books ever written.
Most definitely. I don't know, where do we go from here? I mean, in some sense, we have a path forward with the plot of the novel. We could talk about uh, the discovery of Fyodor Karamazov's body. We can talk about Dmitri and Katerina and Grushenka and that sort of love triangle. We definitely have to talk about the trial, because it's probably the funniest part of the book. Your choice. Where do you want to go next?
Well, let's focus on. I'm gonna. So after, of course, this moment with Grushenka, the story of the onion, we get, of course, he returns, of course, to the monastery. He falls asleep. He dreams that he is with Christ at the wedding in Cana, which, of course, this is where Christ turns water into wine. Sorry, Baptists, it's wine, not grape juice. But anyways, he's in this dream, and of course, Elder Zosima is there, and he tells Alyosha to be happy. Alyosha's helped redeem Grushenka. The young woman will help find salvation. He wakes. He's praying. He's kissing the earth. He's prostrating. And even though he doesn't mind about the odor, and he's eager, and his faith is strengthened despite what other people are saying. He's ready to go on with his life and to do what was told by Elder, even if people are ignoring him. And I think, again, this brings us now to, we get a sharp cut right after this, and we're going straight back to Dmitri. And Dmitri, you know how you see all the, what are those memes where it's like, oh, Paul Newman's own, and they do the Photoshop, and it's like, Paul Newman's fucking pissed, and it's Dmitri Karamazov is fucking pissed, and we get a Dmitri that's like, I want my hoe, I want my money, I'm ready to kill my dad, I'm angry, screw you, dad, I'm so mad at you. And we see again,
don't come to the Karamazov house, you're pretty cool.
Yeah, don't come to Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov's house at 7:00. If you tap a special sign, you may be whacked with a mortar and pestle. But yeah, I mean, this is where we get a sharp cut, and I mean, again, bam, sharp jump. It's a movie jump cut. Just like bam, jump cut. We just had this moment of redemption and in faith, and now we're going to see the exact opposite of that. And so, yeah, Dimitri's fucking pissed. It's bad.
And I think this is, if I remember correctly, this is where we're introduced to Katerina Ivanovna, who is Dimitri's betrothed. He's taken a lot of money from her that he owes back to her, and he's basically called off. He's called off their engagement, but she won't let him call it off. She's stubbornly sticking with him, even though she doesn't even really like him. But it's she has this stubborn pride, and
she also has her own sense of faith in Dmitri
right. What can we
to
say?
redeem himself.
Right. And we can talk about that a little bit. Is it that she has pride, or sorry, is it she has faith, or that she has the appearance of faith?
I think that there is pride in this instance. I mean, this is in a time where if an engagement breaks off, that's a very serious social matter. That's sort of an embarrassment that you're not married. And so you're clinging on to the appearances, but like, oh, he'll come back. He'll come back. She's in denial, but she also has faith when confronted by others, that maybe he can redeem himself. But in this instance, of course, he wants the pump. And of course, we just had this beautiful moment where Grushenka is redeeming herself. She flees. She's going back to her former lover. She's going back to the officer whom she loved and wants to marry and to set herself right. And Grushenka, of course, not being there, Dmitri is, again, he's just flown into a fit of rage.
He thinks that she's with his father.
With his father.
He's intending to go back to the house and see them fooling around.
Yep. And he knows that there is a sign, a knock on the door, a certain kind of, shape and a haircut style knock, that he knows that that's where I need to go and to do what's necessary. And of course, he thinks that Smirnikov has told Grushenka, or has told his father, about all this. And ooh, that's interesting, And of course, we already know in the backdrop of this that we've got how they're going to interact with one another. And is the moment he realizes that Grushenka's not there, he thinks he's with his dad. We've got to do the secret sign. And of course, he opens the door, and Fyodor Pavlovich is not there. Grushenka's not in the house, because why would he respond like a Pavlovian sign to the knock on the door if he's with her? So of course, Dmitri, still very pissed and in the dark and in the night, he's got a small brass pestle. He's ready to go beat his father again, just like he has before. And instead, who does he run into? Well, he runs into Grigory, the loyal servant. They fight. He beats him. Grigory is bleeding. Dmitri, in a panic, tends to the wound. His clothes are bloody, which of course does not look very good later on in the trial. And with Grushenka gone, he's not with his father, doesn't know where to go to, and he needs money, and this is what he's got to do. His life is meaningless. So let's go kill ourselves, and let's go do what's necessary.
And I mean, well, he decides that he pays for this huge orgy, like father, like son. He if he's going out, he's going out.
I'm going to go out with a bang.
The most bacchanalian way possible. There's wine, there's women, there's. I might as well go out happy, quote unquote. Let's say.
Yeah.
And he even runs into Grushenka, and he dresses her down, and he embarrasses her because he thinks that he's been betrayed.
Yeah. He's just doubling down on his anger and his frustration. Listen, you've betrayed me. You're leaving. You're gone. What is this whole point? You've been leading me around. I've been doing all this stuff for you. I've suffered for you. Just absolute anger. So he's just doubled down. I'm going to get this money. I'm taking this money. I'm getting my guns back as collateral from a loan I took earlier. I'm going to go buy my wine and my food for hundreds of rubles, and screw this. I'm going to shoot myself, but we're going to have an orgy first.
And at the end of the chapter, 2 surprises. One, he learns that Grushenka actually does love him, so he must feel like a real asshole at this point. And 2, we find out that Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov has been murdered. And Dmitri is the only suspect.
Yep. And I mean, it doesn't look good.
It does not look good. He's walking around.
Your father is wealthy, and you're walking around bloody. You have weapons. There's a murder weapon that is mysteriously missing.
Everyone knows that he is in debt to a lot of different people. He's walking around the street sort of in a daze. It doesn't look good for Dmitri.
Oh no. Oh no. Does not look good for Dmitri at all. And so he is put on trial for the murder of his father, which we all know he did not murder his father. That goes to the bastard child, Smerdyakov, who hates his father more than anyone out of this book. Like, if you thought Dmitri hates his dad, well, what do you think of the bastard son who has a fake last name that is meant to say, I come from the smelly, crazy idiot?
I come from the stinking Lizaveta.
Yes.
Son of the smelly one. And probably the best part of the book, in my estimation, is the conversation between Smerdyakov and Ivan. And Smerdyakov admits to all this, and he's like, yeah, just like we talked about, like you and me, we see the world for what it is, and we can do whatever we want. There is no God, so everything is permitted. So I hated this guy, and I wouldn't have had the courage to go through with it if it wasn't for you. And aren't you proud of me? And look at this great thing that I've done, sort of thing. And all of Ivan's chickens come home to roost in that moment. He actually, for all of his news clippings, for all of his understanding about how horrible the world is, all his cynicism and his atheism, when there's actual stakes and when there's like blood on his hands, he just loses it.
Yeah. And I mean, this is where the you get racked with the fact that there's the difference, right, between quote unquote theory and praxis. We've got the
you've got Praxoid, Smerdyakov versus Theory Cell, Ivan.
See, you would never hear that sentence anywhere else except for here on Canon Fodder.
Yep. That I'm here to invent new sentences that have never been uttered before and should never be uttered again.
And should never be uttered again. But no, I say that teasingly, but I mean there, and again, this is where for Ivan, right? We have these conversations in the past, but like I had said in the first episode, Smerdyakov is the logical conclusion of Ivan's worldview. And of course, to hear these things, and this has all coincided with the fact that Dmitri is, being interrogated and questioned, and it's the me reaping versus me sowing. Me sowing versus me reaping, and all of a sudden you're just whacked with a hard-hitting realization of the consequences of your actions, and it is that even if you don't love the man, your father is dead.
And I wonder, I wonder, like we talked last time about how Smerdyakov would be the man who would shoot the Romanovs.
Oh
But
yeah.
and this is a book about patricide, but the ultimate form of patricide, in a way, is killing the czar, killing the king of your nation. And I don't really know where I'm going with this, other than to say that I I would not be surprised if whoever ended up firing into that family would later put a bullet in their own brain. Any knowledge there about that?
The assassins of the Tsar, they they are, what's the word I'm looking for? The executioner of the family died in 1938 at the age of 60. He was a commander of the guard during the assassination. He is one of the chief executioners in the assassination. So I don't think any of them, if I recall correctly, killed themselves. But I do know that one of them, who was associated with the murders, lived for quite some time afterwards, and even the murderers themselves, one of them that had uh, lived on for quite some time, he was encountered by the great General Zhukov later in life. And even General Zhukov, this great leader of the Second World War and a sort of like the Soviet man, right? Even Zhukov looked at him with disgust and disdain. I mean, even these people who were, Soviet believers and so on, um, all of a sudden, you got the realization that no one liked these people at all, period. So I think that it's an important thing to consider, that even some of the imperial guards of the Tsar turned on them. But yeah, a few other killers, they would be killed in the 30s. A few others would die in an NKVD prison, but I don't think any of them killed themselves, as far as I know. It's funny because we talk about like archetypes of women. There are horse girls, there are true crime girls, and then there are Tsar Nicholas and the assassination of the royal family kind of women. And that's something that I
That's
there's one.
that's a kind of woman I haven't encountered. Can you go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, so no, there's like there are Romanov girls, and so there are women that are kind of obsessed with the murder and the life of Tsar Nicholas II. And I've met three in my life, which I've always found to be strange. Out of all the things to, as a white American woman, to investigate or to be interested in, it's the assassination of the royal martyrs, Tsar Nicholas II and his family. One
They
of
all
them,
want to they all want to be Princess Anastasia, but
well, some want to be Anastasia, but others, I think, just want to get to the bottom of it, because it is real life true crime, but also it has that flair of the royal and the dramatic. And there's a woman at my church who's writing a story on the Roman, or right, not a story, but she's writing a nonfiction account of the Romanovs' last days. She's got documents that she's petitioned from Russian libraries and such. Like, she's hardcore into it, but she's also exactly who I would expect to really be into this. And she doesn't know who I am on the internet, so I can say this with some semblance of not. I'm not going to say her name or anything like that, but it's just like, she is a childless millennial, an older millennial, and she has her cats and things like that. And she's got this deep love for trying to understand what their last moments were like from what we can recall by history and what others can say of it. And, were there plans to save the royal family and stuff like that? And I'm like, it's kind of strange that I've met three women in my life, not that I've ever dated them or anything like that, but it's just like, there are women really obsessed with this, and I don't have a full understanding as to why. I don't understand the fascination with true crime and such. I don't have a woman brain where I get aroused by murder and violence in that respect. But
yeah,
it's
we have a man
that's a
brain
weird
where we
aside.
get we get aroused by murder and violence in a different way.
Yeah, where we're the ones doing it.
Let's see. Let's talk about the trial. The trial of Dmitry Karamazov, who has been, and you know, not even framed, not even framed for the murder of his father, because
It
that would
just
imply,
magically lined up that way.
yeah, that he's just, you know, no evidence was planted, no malice there. Smerdyakov isn't, you know, setting things up to make it look like, uh it wasn't him that did it, but it was Dmitry. The thing that's actually really messed up about Smerdyakov is he doesn't really have a plan afterwards. He does the murder, and then he just kind of brags about it to Ivan.
Yeah.
You know, there's no, oh, I gotta hide the body, oh, I gotta come up with an alibi, this, that. Like, the closest we get to an alibi is, oh, he had a seizure, or he pretends to have a seizure, rather. That way no one could possibly think that he's the murderer. Uh, but other than that, very, very grug brained, very, I don't need to have a plan. I'm just gonna do, and come what may. But that's not the trial. The trial of Dmitri, in my estimation, probably the funniest part of the book. You have the prosecutor, who has this issue of malapropisms. You have all this evidence that just perfectly lines up. Uh, it's a slam dunk case for this idiot lawyer, and Dmitri really doesn't have a defense.
No. And I mean, again, even if you don't, I mean, even Rakitin visits him in his cell. He wants to write an article saying, like, yeah, that you had no choice. You couldn't help but do it. You were so compounded by your passions and the influence of pride and money and a love for the world that you were just bound to kill yourself. And of course, Dmitri, keeping a stiff upper lip, just kind of laughs him off. And he says, "You can come visit me anytime. I'm going to keep laughing at your ideas." He still maintains his innocence, even if he has no appropriate defense. And we're later, of course, introduced to Katerina Ivanova's, and you know, she's like, no, this dude's pretty guilty, and I got a letter that proves it, which of course is his correspondence with Dmitri saying he's here to settle his affairs once and for all. But you know, Alyosha, whom we've passed over it, but Alyosha has this lovely side story where we get to see his redemption, wherein he meets old schoolboys who've, you know,
Right? Yeah, I thought we would come back to that, because
okay, no,
it's sort of a separate
it's this whole separate thing.
thing. Yeah,
We can tie that bow up later.
yeah,
But yeah,
because I mean the whole epilogue is that part. So
yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. So we'll go back to the schoolboys after.
Yeah. So, but since then, of course, Ivan has visited Smirdyakov, and you know, Smirdyakov is ill and is dying. You know, since the murder. How convenient. But you know, Smirdyakov is basically dying, and throughout these visits, you know, Ivan is told that Ivan, you know, he's got this seed of guilt in him, like, oh, you wanted Dad to die too. Like, come on, like, you weren't there on the day of the murder. Like, you wanted him to go too.
He explains, like, he wouldn't have really had the courage without Ivan. Like, he sees him and Ivan as, now I wonder how much of it is him trying to share the guilt that he's feeling, or if he's trying to get Ivan to almost absolve him of his own guilt.
Well,
'Cause-
remember though, this is again, we're getting 3 visits, 3 times to absolve ourselves from guilt. Can we deny ourselves in this time? The cock crows 3 times as we meet with Smirdyakov. And of course, the first time, you know, you really wanted him to die. The second time, well, you've got nothing to it. You know, you're not responsible. You do not know this man. After all, the letter says that Dmitri will kill Fyodor Pavlovich if it's necessary to repay her the 3,000 rubles. Ivan I'm not responsible. It's Dmitri. I have no part in these passing events at all. And then, of course, the third time, all of this guilt comes in where he's trying to absolve himself. Yes, my brother is guilty. Bam. Remember all those discussions? If there is no God, man can do anything. And I believe you, Ivan. You are guilty. I killed my father, your father, because of your ideas. I am the logical conclusion of everything that I have ever done. And so, Ivan, you too must suffer. But he can go in there and prove his brother's innocence. And of course, the devil
he just goes crazy instead.
And he goes absolutely batshit insane. The devil visits him in a dream, and kind of like King Lear to some extent, with like the fool and whatnot, and the furies that endures the king. But this time, it's a nice, well-dressed, middle-aged man. Think 19th century Russian suit. And it's just the G-man saying, like, yeah, you're fucking crazy. You're going to hell. You're responsible for this. You've been so doubtful and insecure. What kind of brother are you? And even though he fights back and tries to defend himself, he goes insane.
Yeah, he's visited by the devil in this European. I think it's more a European suit.
Yeah, I think so.
And like it's like. Maybe specifically French, like almost like this French gentleman, this embodiment of the philosophy that he's based his life around. It's very much, because I mean Dostoevsky, his whole thing is, Russia is separate from Europe and should remain so. You have Peter the Great earlier in Russia's history, who's like, we're kind of a Russian nation, and they bring French to the court, and they move the capital to St. Petersburg, because they model that after a thoroughly European city. And Dostoevsky, he's kind of reactionary in this way. He says,
not a big fan of the French.
No, not a big fan of Europe. He is very much
anti-foreign influence onto his people.
Right, exactly. He's and in War and Peace by Tolstoy, there's this idea of Moscow versus Petersburg, and you see that tension. If Tolstoy is the sort of Petersburg gentry novelist, then Dostoevsky is the more provincial Moscow novelist, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I mean, we also have the anti-French attitude as well from the Napoleonic War, this uneasy alliance that would emerge later on. But again, that's a side bit to Tchaikovsky and how great the overture of 1812 is.
Right. And I mean, and then that also kind of brings up the what we talked about last time with the War of 1812, and how you have the Russians are being attacked by the people they most admire, and it really does something to their psyche, so that later on, when they have their own revolution, it's like, oh, we have to have our own French Revolution, so let's do it bigger and better and more Russian, and obviously it leads to where it leads.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
this the trial itself, I think the better parts of it, I do think really are from outside of this, and of course Ivan breaks down, but hey, don't worry, good news. You don't have to visit Smirdyakov anymore. Like you've been, trying to do this. And I say good news, tongue in cheek, but
right.
Hey, Smirdyakov he's killed himself. He's hung himself. He's dead. And of course, Alyosha and Ivan are left together now. And Alyosha, recovered in his faith and strength, is praying and hoping for his recovery and trying to mend him. But unfortunately for Dmitri, the real killer has killed himself. The logical conclusion of a man's sins inevitably means he will meet the wages of those sins, and the wages of sin is death. And like Judas, Smirjikov hangs himself, or hung himself.
Right. And so there's an interesting part of the trial, the part that probably convicts Dmitri over any other part, when Katerina produces the letter that Dmitri wrote, where he talks about how he wants to kill his father. Right. And she almost doesn't bring it up, but she's in love with Ivan.
Yeah.
She's in love with Ivan. She's going to marry Dmitri because she thinks that's what is supposed to happen. She won't be embarrassed. She's too prideful to let him break off their engagement. And also, I mean, he's into her for, a few thousand rubles. But she's desperately in love with Ivan, and seeing him suffer, leads her to betray Dmitri.
Yeah.
And the reason that I brought up, and that's the reason I brought up earlier, like, does she have faith, or does she have the perception of faith? Because she's just, Alyosha wouldn't do that. Alyosha wouldn't knowingly lie.
No.
To get back at anyone, or even for the noble purpose of saving someone that she loves, or that he loves, rather. The truth is the truth, and he'll walk in the truth no matter what, even if it causes temporary pain. So Katerina's whole deal is she wants to be she wants to be seen as a good person, and she's at least at this point in the book, she definitely is not.
Oh no. And I mean, like, again, she's got her own interests to do so, and she's already convinced in her heart that Dmitri did kill his father. And of course the trial is interesting because it's almost as if you get the inverse to Kill a Mockingbird, where it's just like this lawyer is defending a black man in an all-white jury, and it's like, actually, the most educated man in Moscow, this great famous defense attorney, is coming to your defense, Dmitri. It's going to be the talk of all of Russia, but you're a jury of your peers are all these peasants that fucking hate you, and they're kind of retarded. And
as much as they hate Fyodor Pavlovich, like patricide is like the worst thing you can do. And all of that hatred and malice that they had for Fyodor Pavlovich actually is moved to Dmitri.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, and he does his best. Yakovich, just like, listen, Grigory, you were on a lot of drugs that night. Your senses aren't reliable, which of course he was on strong medicine because Dmitri beat the shit out of him. The doctors are offering, contradicting theories. This is where you get the condition of the mind. And of course the German, the German doctor. And I'm thinking about psychology again, like we were discussing.
Mm-hmm.
All of course the discussion of who he was as a little boy. He's not this evil. And of course Dmitri weeps. There's some sympathy here. Alyosha's up on the stand, and he's just talking about maybe he was wearing the money around his neck, but Alyosha also admits that he thinks Smirjikov was the real murderer. And Katerina Ivanova, despite having her own issues, right? Katerina offers the story of Dmitri saving her father from prison and all that he's done throughout his life. Again, we're just getting this like basically a judgment. Your sins are now on display. Your actions, everything you have ever done in your life. We're getting a mock-up of the judgment that we will all receive one day. And Dimitri's entire life is now cast into the public space.
Dimitri's not guilty of this murder.
No.
But he is guilty.
Yes.
And I guess the question is, like, and this parallels Dostoevsky's life as well, because, you know, whether he was guilty of trying to kill the Tsar, plotting against the Tsar, probably not. I mean, from what I've heard about I think it's the Petrushevsky circle that he was in, but the literary sort of Western socialist circle that he was running in, they weren't the Bolsheviks. You know what I mean? Tsar Alexander, I think it was Tsar Alexander II, was murdered. So, you know, any sort of talk about overthrowing the Tsar was going to lead to a sort of, you know, a heavy penalty. But while Dostoevsky was probably no revolutionary, he was all the moments of his life that led up to that. If he was going to be guilty for something, he was guilty for all of it, if that makes sense. And in the same way, Dmitri is guilty, even if it's not for the crime that he committed.
Yeah, and I mean, oftentimes we may think that it's one thing that damns us to hell or to punishment, when it turns out it's something completely different. And unfortunately, one's character, even if they did not commit this specific thing that he's on trial for, which is obviously murder, it really doesn't matter. Because really the prosecutor's just gonna smack it down and say, listen, unlike Smirchikov, you know, like, everything you have ever said and done throughout most of your adult life has been this resentful motivation to kill yourself, to kill your father. And Krylovich, or Sidorovich, you know, just goes out of his way to just say, you know, we have to do it. We need justice. You know, patricide is the worst crime of all. And so screw this. You know, we're going to put you down. Of course, you know, you have the defense attorney Fedyakovich doing everything that he can to say, listen, you know, sir, you know, you got circumstance, conjecture, there's no proof, but proof be damned. You know, the letter be damned. Really, it's not the case at all. If anything, what must be done is the fact that, you know, everything in the world can point to it, and you can have all the psychology that says he hates his father, but none of the nothing that we've seen today illustrates that he's done it. But again, even
but he's not on trial. He's not on trial for the murder of his father. In a lot of ways, he's on trial for his own sins and his father's sins.
Absolutely. And I mean, this is the big deal about this whole trial, because it's not, the murder is just the animating movement here. What we're getting instead is a delightful literary, you know, I guess maybe I don't know the exact word, but we're getting the judgment seat of Christ in a courtroom drama. The murder doesn't matter. It's your life. What did you do with your life? What are your sins? What are your good deeds? How did you respond to these things?
You know,
and so, you know, you didn't. Yeah.
Will you hear, well done, good and faithful servant? Or will you hear, turn away from me, for I never knew you?
Exactly. And we kind of know the answer to that here. And that even if you can pull off that, you know, as Fedyakovich tries so best, his best to save him, this isn't about the murder anymore. This is about your life. And obviously, despite only being in his later 20s at 27, Dmitri has not been a good and faithful servant, and has not served his father well, and has been an arrogant, pompous, man who's risen through the ranks, fallen through the ranks, has done duels, has saved men, wants his money, and has allowed himself to be consumed by debauchery, pride, and gluttony. And here we are. And so, despite the best efforts to cast a reasonable doubt on whether or not he killed his father, it does not matter, as Dmitri is sentenced to prison.
Okay, so that's the trial. And, Dostoevsky, it's obvious that he has a lot of disdain for the trial by jury. I could make commentary about several recent events and the creation of kangaroo courts, but this is a literary podcast, so we won't be doing that. There are a group of schoolboys that live in the town that Alyosha encounters on a few different occasions, and one of them is almost like a mini Ivan. He's a Western, he's a Westaboo, I guess we could say. He's a socialist. He's all of these great things that Ivan kind of sees himself as, and Alyosha kind of makes it his mission in a lot of ways, even if he doesn't exactly say it out loud, but to save these boys.
Yeah. And this is actually, well, we're introduced to these characters actually right before the trial, although we do get to see the aftermath in the epilogue. And again, we get to see Alyosha's...
we even see them like really early on in the book. Like, I think it's set up even earlier in like the first half of the book.
It is, but really their main story is sort of told out in book 10. So this is long after, we've also done a time jump, so that the trial takes place in winter. It's in November, right in the beginning of November. So we've taken a time jump. So it's after Lent, it's after Easter, the summer's passed, the father has been buried, etc. But we are introduced to the schoolboys at times, and their mom is away, and he wants to go visit his friend who's fallen ill, and Alyosha has done a good job at convincing the other schoolboys to visit him, but this older boy, well, he's really 13 years old, Kolya, has not visited him at all, and he hasn't met with Alyosha either. But we're getting to see just these children, and everything to go and see. Really, this is more Alyosha's story than it is the boys, in part because Alyosha is trying his best to follow through with what Elder Zosima had said, and Alyosha doesn't talk to them like they're children. Alyosha's only 20 years old, but Alyosha is speaking to these like 12, 10, 13-year-old boys as if they are children, or as if they are adults, not children. And again, we get to see Alyosha take on a role where he is the spiritual father, and he is trying to have influence, and going in there. And we learn, of course, that the boys, being rough and tumble as they are, Kolya had been stabbed once over the treatment of an animal, and his friends. And
yeah, and Ilyusha, he feeds bread to a dog with like a knife
with
in
a
it,
pin.
or not pin. That's it, and it cuts up the dog, and Kolya doesn't. He won't stand for that.
Nope.
So say what you will about him, but he has principles. And even though Ilyusha,
animal abusers get the knife,
even though his friend is sick and dying, he just can't forgive that.
No.
So we see in this chapter with the boys, You know,
Alyosha is very quick to call him out, saying, like, listen, your friend is ill because your friend abuses his dogs and God is punishing him. Based. Anyway.
yeah. It's like, you get what you effing deserve.
Yeah, you get what you... Yeah, that's so true.
But at the end of the novel, in the epilogue, we see that Alyosha is dead, but because of Alyosha's intervention, he's first reconciled with Kolya, and Kolya has his pretension sort of broken, and he's on the right path. So Alyosha is fulfilling his elder's order,
and he is becoming
do,
like his elder,
right? Which really sucks because in the notes for the Alyosha sequel that never gets written, Alyosha at some point falls away from his orders, which I don't know. I don't see how that could have happened. But I guess that's why I'm not Dostoevsky.
Yeah, I mean, I do know that there was, according to his wife, he had discussed plans for a sequel that would have focused on Alyosha, and
I mean, even in the introduction, that's sort of alluded to.
it is, but we never know how it would have played out, and I think I would have been, I think it was called The Life of a Great Sinner, but I'm kind of, again, I think it is good that was never written.
Thank God he died.
I didn't want to say it like that,
but yeah, no, and obviously,
but thank God that this great novel was never tarnished by a sequel.
Like how some people are like, oh, why did they put out Harper Lee's notes for the Kill a Mockingbird sequel?
Yeah.
Anyway, epilogue. Dmitri is found guilty. He is sent to Siberia.
Just like Dostoevsky was.
Yep, there is a plan to bribe a guard so that he doesn't have to. Basically, they're gonna do they discuss that they're gonna do a sort of prison break and make sure that Dmitri doesn't have to actually endure that punishment, because they all know that Smerdyakov is the one who murdered their
But Dmitri
father.
tells them no. Dmitri basically is desiring
penance.
and longing
He's
for
looking
penance.
and he gets penance from Katerina Ivanovna. Grushenka is actually going to join him out there. They declare their love for one another, and I forget. Does Ivan and Katerina, do they get together, or is that kind of?
It's
I don't remember.
I believe it's implied.
Yeah.
Because she's there to really bring Ivan back from his madness and the guilt that he feels. And so, of course, Katerina, of course, leaves, but I mean, Dmitri reproaches Grushenka, and of course, that kind of ends well together. However, Katerina Ivanova doesn't blame Grushenka for not forgiving her. But we also do see in this world where I suppose really just that things end on a note of optimism in the middle of a funeral as well. I mean, in part because Alyosha has emerged as the continuing teacher, but Dmitri, out of all of these three brothers, as I said at the beginning, is the one who is probably going to be the most well off out of the three of them. Because as we just described the courtroom scene, it's not about the murder, it's about your life. And Dmitri has been given a chance by, of course, an error of the court to redeem himself. And he ends up with who he wants to be with, and she's willing to redeem herself as well. And at the end of it all, his brother's recovering. Alyosha has assumed a role of a young elder. But I guess for me, really, at the end of it all, Dmitri is the one that is the most redemptive. And I know that sounds cruel, but I mean, in the sense that we don't get a lot of second chances in life. And yeah, he's going to do hard time and for something that he did not commit, but he is going to walk out of that much like Dostoevsky did and find himself closer to God and with a woman that he loves, and to make himself set aright in his penance and to seek repentance for the rest of his life, which most people when they encounter mortality or a bad event, it gets treated like a sitcom where people will have this moment where they're like, isn't life important? Isn't life special? Isn't it so dear and near to us that we must do these things? And then it just gets played off for laughs and life goes back to normal after the 30 minutes or after
Right,
however
right.
long people recover.
The full house hugging and crying, and
Yeah.
everybody learned their lesson and everything goes back to status quo.
When it really isn't that way. It's so much more than that. But nevertheless, it in this story, we see the foundations laid for everyone to take on their life. And again, iron is sharpened by iron and metal meddled by metal, and suffering and our choice to be part of it requires us to respond and to answer the call of how do we respond to suffering. And all three of these men, all three of these brothers, are given chances to redeem themselves, and we are given our Judas Iscariot, and to do exactly what Judas did, which was to kill himself after betraying his father and killing him. And again, we're given a look into the Russian mind, into Dostoevsky's mind, but also the response to suffering in a world where it seems so meaningless and obtuse and pointless. I really don't
And
know how else to really
yeah,
end
I mean
there.
that's perfect in a lot of ways. I'm gonna ask final thoughts anyway.
Well, I guess really what I would just simply say is that the book is long, but it is well worth your time to read, and that if you're someone who doesn't believe, and I don't mean in a specific church or doctrine, but just has issues with the current world, this book will help. As with any story that Dostoevsky has written, you will learn quite a bit, not only of the Russian mind, but also of just a mind of a man who has already been deeply afflicted by his own suffering and decisions and has come to find and seek repentance in his work. Dostoevsky is a great man and has written arguably one of the greatest books in the entire sort of canon of fiction. Um, he's the Russian Dickens in a lot of respect, but unlike Dickens, he still has a connection to God that is very hard to find in some of the Western writers today. Read it. You will learn to appreciate it. It is the book that kept me from being a full-blown atheist. And I sincerely pray to your listeners that such a thing may happen to them, that they may find something more than just excellent prose on a page or the idiosyncrasies of translation, but find something that will set them on a much better path.
Well, Mr. Prudentialist, where can people find you? What do you want to plug?
Well, I am a writer. You can find me at theprudentialist.substack.com. I'm currently going through a lengthy book series myself. I'm currently going through chapter by chapter with guests and friends of Sean McMeekin's voluminous work, Stalin's War, New History of World War II, going through it chapter by chapter and breaking down just how important that history is and why it's a new and fresh look at our understanding in the mythologies of the Second World War. But I also comment on the media landscape, digital ecology, and you'll always find me out there as sort of this reactionary amphibian. And you can find all of my links and what I do at findmyfriends.net/theprudentialist. I'm on YouTube, Twitter, Telegram, all podcast platforms, and wherever videos might be seen and heard.
Well, thank you very much for joining me. Once again, this is TR Hudson for the Double Dealer magazine, and I hope that you have a wonderful day. Goodbye.